The story of debtor's prison. It might seem unimaginable today, but not all that long ago, people who couldn't pay their debts were sentenced to prison. Prior to the mid-19th century, debtors' prisons were a common way to deal with unpaid debt. Beginning in the 11th century, people in England who fell into debt were locked up in a series of prisons around the country. One of the most notorious was called the Clink. Life in these prisons was a form of slave labor. It was not just debtors that were sentenced to prison, but in many cases their entire families along with them. The length of their stay was determined largely at the whim of their creditors. Other European countries had legislation limiting imprisonment for debt to only 1 year, but debtors in England were imprisoned until their creditors were satisfied, no matter how long that took. Another debtors' prison in London was Fleet Prison. It usually contained about 300 prisoners and their families who were forced to pay for their keep. At the time, prisons were profit-making enterprises. Prisoners had to pay for food and lodging. There were fees for bathing or for taking irons off. Fleet Prison had the highest fees in England. There was even a grill built into the Farringdon Street prison wall so that prisoners might beg for alms for the poor from passers-by. For prisoners who could afford the fees, it came with upgrade accommodations that included access to a pub, shop, and restaurant, not unlike the mafioso prison wing depicted in the movie Goodfellas. The upgrade fee also gave prisoners a crucial work release privilege of being allowed to leave the prison during the day, which meant debtors could earn money to pay off their creditors. Everyone else was crammed into small rooms with dozens of others, possibly for decades, for even the most modest of debts, which of course increased as unpaid prison fees accumulated. Prisoners were allowed to leave the prison to earn money to help pay their debts, plus what they now owed to the prison. Their families were kept behind bars as a form of human collateral. In some cases, children grew up in debtors' prison. These prisons did not discriminate when it came to debt, and they affected people at all levels of society, including naval officers, economists, publishers, and global explorers. Because these prisons were privately administered, whole economies were created around the debtor communities, with the prison keepers charging rent, the so-called jailer's fee, bailiffs charging for food and clothing, attorneys charging legal fees in fruitless efforts to get the debtors out, and creditors, often tradesmen, increasing the debt, like a juice loan from The Sopranos, simply because the debtors were in jail. The result was that the prisoners' families, including children, often had to be sent to work simply to pay the costs of keeping the breadwinner in prison. Still, debts continued to accumulate to the point where there was no realistic prospect of release. For the vast majority of people stuck in debtors' prison, their debt compounded and their stay lasted the rest of their lives. Sound familiar? The prisons were so profitable that the wardens usually got their jobs by being the highest bidders. This custom made the prisons notorious for the cruelties inflicted on the people. As such, the prisoners were regularly beaten and tortured by their jailers. One warden, Thomas Bainbridge, who became warden in 1728, was especially cruel. He was found guilty of the greatest extortions upon prisoners, and was found by the House of Commons to have arbitrarily and unlawfully thrown prisoners in dungeons, put them in irons, loaded them with additional debt, and destroyed their chances to pay off their debt. There was one special district of London called the Mint, which offered a safe harbor protection for debtors. People who were at risk from being thrown into debtors' prison could run to the Mint district, and nobody could touch them. We could use something like that today. Nonetheless, the Mint was hardly a debtor's holiday. Those who went to the Mint would frequently die of malnutrition or murder before raising enough money to escape their debts. Even the father of Charles Dickens was sent to prison. The Victorian-era author of A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and Tale of Two Cities saw his father committed to debtor's prison, where his family later moved to join him. It was not until the family received an inheritance that they were able to pay their debt and leave. The experience had such an effect on young Dickens that the theme of debtor's prison appeared throughout his writing over the years, and he became a constant advocate for improving the quality of life of the poor in England and around the world. Had Dickens and his family not been able to escape debtor's prison, many of the stories that we now know and love may never have been written. When the Bankruptcy Act of 1869 marked the end of debtors' prison, you would think that the idea of being a prisoner of debt became a thing of the past. Unfortunately, that couldn't be more untrue. You're in your own 21st century version of the debtor's prison, and it's even bigger than before. Today, there are 50 million Americans locked up in the 21st century version of debtor's prison. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the debt problem, 50 million debtors works out to more people than the combined populations of Mongolia, Puerto Rico, New Zealand, Ireland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Israel, Switzerland, and Sweden. That's a pretty big prison. No matter what circumstances you face in life, you always have a choice about your next action. We want you and the millions of people stuck in today's version of debtor's prison to be free of debt and on their way to building a prosperous future. We know we can get you there. If you're ready to make a real change and get compassionate, understanding, and expert support, then call us. We'll provide you with a free debt reduction strategy session. We'll help you analyze your current debt and show you options for getting you back on the road to your dreams, and show you the options available to you right now to transform your situation. All you have to do is call the toll-free number listed below this video, and we'll take care of you.